and I'm going to read for you the talk I gave in Leipzig in September 2012 at the Panchatantra symposium. My talk was, the title of my talk was Anvar-e Sohayli, a 15th century Persian prose rewriting of the famous animal fables. So I am not going to talk a lot about the whole, what we know about the Sanskrit version of the Panchatantra. This is going to be very much navigating in the Persian waters. And my focus is on this 15th century prose rewriting by the Persian author who is called Anvar-e Sohayli. And in particular, the focus of my talk is what this Anvar-e Sohayli has to say in the introduction to his rewriting of these animal fables. Now, I am taking it that everybody knows about these fables. So the book is consists in introduction by the author, and then we have frame stories in which other frame stories occur, in which mostly animals but also humans are interacting, are relating to each other, and then we have a moral to the stories that we have just been reading. So, although the focus of my talk is very particular, I'm sure you will agree that the introduction that the author is giving in his work is fascinating in itself. It's fascinating because it contains a remarkable amount of information on the author's, the writer's aims when he wants to rewrite these stories. Why is he doing that? They exist already, the book is in Persian is perfectly well known and respected. So one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, what happens in the mind of this 15th century author? Why does he want to rewrite it and produce another version of these fables? And the aims, as I will argue in my conclusions, the aims of the author take a step back from the traditional Arabic and Persian attitude towards the fables and towards the story of the fables. So, the collection of the fables known in the Arabic Persian world as Kalila and Dimna, this collection is noteworthy very much for its tortuous history and its propagation throughout the old world, and more specifically for somebody who's focusing on Persian literature, the propagation and the history of the work within the Persian literary world, which is my field of investigation. It's especially remarkable as a phenomenon of rewriting and of reinterpretation of this text. Rather than condemning the rewriter for straying a little further away from the original, let us rather celebrate the misreadings and the innovations of the author, and let us examine what this author managed to do with these very old fables, which are actually an open text, what we call an open text, a text that is lending itself to reinterpretations and diverse uses. What we can look at today is the statement of the Intentio Auctoris in the preface created by Anvar-e Sohayli. And what we can ask ourselves, but we won't have the time to do it here, but we need to see whether there is a coherence between this statement of intent that the author proposes and the actual changes that he is introducing in his new text, in his new version. So, who is this author? Well, Anvar-e Sohayli is a preacher, a very serious, very respected figure at the court, culturally ebullient court of the Timurid Sultan Hossein Baykara. He is the very civilized great-grandson of the conqueror Timur. He rules at Herat in present-day Afghanistan, and he makes Herat into a buzzing artistic center. Kashifi at the court of Hossein Baikara is the equivalent of the figures of our European Renaissance men. He knows just about everything there is to know, and he attempts to summarize this knowledge for his Timurid audience. He is the author of a whole collection of works, and the last subject that he tackles during his life is this new version of the Fables. Amongst the elements which he mentions in his preface, I pinpoint, in an effort to meet the interest of my learned audience of Sanskritists today, I pinpoint the origins and the line of rewriters of the fables within the Persianate world, and this is something that our author puts a lot of emphasis on. Following on this, I finish with the exploration of the significant innovations which he introduces in his rewriting. So, in his preface, Kashifi sketches the noble heredity of the text. He has consulted his immediate source text, but he introduces a few details and variations. However, all in all, this is simply a reproduction of the standard story of the fables, which we find in Persian literature and which has been adopted in a general way by all distinct areas of the fable stories. We find the beginnings of the story of the fables, for example, in the Shahnameh, which is a very important Persian 9th or 10th century text. So, I will briefly look at each of the steps outlined by Anvar-e Sohayli and add each time a few comments. There is both fascination and relish in Kashifi's retelling of the famous and politically incorrect case of Borzoye's discovery and translation of the Sanskrit text into Pahlavi. In effect, this is a violation by the Persian envoy Borzoye of a well-guarded Indian state secret. Borzoye introduces the text to the multicultural Sasanian court of Khosrow Anushirvan. Khosrow became famous in later history for his wisdom and positive rule, helped, as Anvar-e Sohayli states in his introduction, by the advice he found in this very text of fables. The text itself is jealously kept in the Persian king's treasury. And it's important to note that this probably unique Pahlavi manuscript produced for Khosrow Anushirvan did not reach us, and even its so-called Old Syriac translation only exists in a unique and much later manuscript, and is probably not a straightforward reflection of this lost Pahlavi 6th century text. It's also important to note that already from this stage onwards, the text is much longer than the 5 chapters we find in the Sanskrit Pañcatantra. I'm just never happy to read or to hear that the Arabo-Persian version is just a translation of the Sanskrit text. It's more than twice as long, and the 5 chapters of the Sanskrit text are just part of it. 2 centuries later, in the mid-8th century AD, the Arabic Abbasid ruling family manages to, as Kashifi says, to lay their grasping little hands, actually Kashifi says their claws, on this mysterious Pahlavi text, and they order its translation by Ibn al-Muqaffa, a Persian who had extremely close political ties to a branch of the ruling Abbasid family. Ibn al-Muqaffa is considered one of the fathers of elegant Arabic prose, but I call him a tragic figure because he was most vilely murdered, probably because he was embroiled in political conspiracy. Again, we do not have the manuscript of Ibn al-Muqaffa's Arabic text. Possibly it also existed as a unique manuscript kept in the treasury of the Abbasid rulers. What is known today as the Ibn al-Muqaffa version of the fables is in fact an artificial reconstruction based on widely differing Arabic manuscripts, on the Syriac version, on Persian versions, and on the Sanskrit versions. And all these versions have been collapsed together in order to create what might have been Ibn al-Muqaffa's original Arabic text. Ibn al-Muqaffa is also known as not only the translator of this Pahlavi version, but also as the author who has added at least two chapters to the core of the stories. So this is an author engaging with his text, not just a translator. And this is the fact, this is what happens to most of the authors who are presenting new versions of the fables. Again, there's a hiatus of about 2 centuries, during which time history goes its course, and the Persian world increasingly finds independence from the Arabic Baghdad rulers, and in the early 10th century comes the time of the Persian literary revival. Literary texts, prose and especially poetry, written in Persian pop up in the eastern lands of the old Iranian Empire, in Khorasan and Transoxiana. Suddenly, without us knowing how or why, the Samanid vizier Bal'ami, who lives in the 10th century, orders a Persian prose translation of the text. And this Persian prose translation is then famously versified by the father of Persian poetry, who is the great poet Ruymbeke. Neither of these two versions, the prose version ordered by Bal'ami and the poem written by Ruymbeke, neither of these have reached us, apart from stray verses by Ruymbeke which are mentioned in anthologies. But what I think is worthwhile to note is that at this point there is a remarkable revolution in the history of the text. For the first time, the very act of versifying it, the text leaves its exclusive royal readership. It steps from the treasury into the open. It's meant for the ears and the eyes of an audience. It is, in the words of the old introduction to the Shahnameh, it is on the lips of one and all. But we have received no information about the impact of the text on this dramatically enlarged audience. The Persian political renaissance is short-lived, as at the very end of the 10th century, Turks, dynamic both on the military and the political front, take over an immense chunk of the Eastern Abbasid Empire. However, these Turks continue to patronize the Persian culture and they respect the Caliph in Baghdad. The great Mahmud of Ghazna rules in Khorasan, invades India, and attempts to transform his capital city also into a cultural center. One of his descendants orders a translation from the Arabic Ibn al-Muqaffa text of the fables into Persian, and we are in the mid-12th century. Presumably, Ruydaki's poem and Bal'ami's prose version were not available to the Ghaznavid Turks. And so it's a member of the state administration, Nasrullah Munshi, who has the idea, who produces a first chapter and then prompts the interest of the prince. Nasrullah Munshi's text earns fame, though in a sad reminiscence of the tragic Ibn al-Muqaffa, Nasrullah Munshi will also end his days in a dungeon, also apparently for political crimes. His text, posthumously, is honored as an excellent piece of Persian prose, and no one seems to regret that it has left the hidden darkness of the ruler's treasury. Intriguingly, there now comes a flush of Kalila and Dimna versions. We know of 2 further 12th and 13th century rewritings in Persian. Authors such as Nizami or Maulana Rumi integrate, transform and comment on some fables within their poems. This is also the period when copies of the Arabic Ibn al-Muqaffa text suddenly appear. And this is also the moment when copies of the Panchatantra Sanskrit text are produced. I wonder what could have happened for the text to be put on the marketplace and to become a bestseller. Nasrullah Munshi is attentive to stress the Islamic element in his text. We are handicapped by the absence of an old and reliable Ibn al-Muqaffa text in order to judge the differences that Nasrullah Munshi has introduced. We don't know how much of the Islamization of the text is due to the Arabic author Ibn al-Muqaffa or to the Persian rewriter. But what we can see is that the Persian text gives numerous quotations from the Quran, and that the animals pepper their dialogues with Arabic verses and moral sayings, which sometimes sit most incongruously on the practical amorality of the text. Nasrullah Munshi's language is flowery, involved with many Arabic words. He tells us that this is a mirror for princes. This is a work that contains advice. This is a didactical work. But Nasrullah struggles because he tries to superimpose on the text the Islamic view on monarchy. The monarch is God's shadow on earth. His actions must be moral in accordance with the examples given by the Prophet and the early caliphs. The problem is that these examples mainly deal with the attitude of the monarch towards his people, while the fables illustrate the far trickier and dangerous relationship between the ruler and his viziers and his courtiers. And this creates a tension between the action of the fables and the moral lessons, and that leads to the reader's puzzlement and often to his frustration. But despite this difficulty, Nasrullah's Persian version of the text is respected, acclaimed as a literary success. But 4 centuries later, in the Persanophile world of the Timurids in Herat, the text has fallen into disregard. The main reason, explains Kashifi in his preface, is that the text is too complicated. There are too many Arabic quotations. People in the 15th century Persian-speaking world are not that familiar any longer with Arabic, and they're lazy, and they don't like to run to a dictionary every 2 seconds to unravel difficult bilingual prose and Quranic quotations. Thus, Kashifi responds to the wishes of his patron, the General Anvar-e Sohayli, who desires that the largest possible public should enjoy the lessons from this excellent collection of fables. Kashifi now sets to work and produces a text which will be attractive to 2 different publics. Those who read with their eyes and enjoy the surface meaning, who will like the stories, the animals interacting, the humor, the morality. But the book is also going to prove fascinating for those who read it with their brain and who will grasp the message nestling underneath the words and the situations. Kashifi is true to his word, and he scratches about 75% of the Arabic verses and quotations, but he also brings in changes which reach deeper than the surface problem of the style of the work. Although a theologian himself, he has a firm grounding in Greek philosophy, and he takes a firm stance against the understanding of the fables as moral tales. This is not a work about morality, says he in his preface. This is about practical politics. And what is fascinating is that in the new frame story which he composes, he moves away from the Islamic theory of kingship, with presenting the ruler as God's shadow on earth, and he proposes instead a Persian theory. Incidentally, by doing this, he also posits a Persian core of problems which find their illustration only in India. How does he do that? Well, he introduces a new frame story to the whole work. And this is the story of the king Humayun Fall and his vizier Hojaste Rai. They form the ideal ruler-advisor couple in an ideal kingdom. One day, out hunting, they stop by a tree in which the king spots a bee nest. This is the opportunity for the vizier to set out a theory of monarchy which relate to Greek authors and which stresses the necessity for a ruler to be able to use coercion, to use siyasat. There are other issues in the frame story and I can't examine them here, but however, having established the necessity for a ruler to firmly keep his people in hand, Kashifi now moves to a second embedded frame story, and that is the story of Dabshalim and Bidpay, which is also present in the older versions of Kalila and Dimna, but which Kashifi totally reworks from what we find in the Arabic version. Dabshalim, in Kashifi's version, is an excellent monarch, extremely generous, and as a reward for his generosity towards his people, he meets a sage living in a cave. And the sage offers him a treasure hidden in that cave. And amongst the treasure there is a box containing the testament of King Hushang. Now this is an invention by Kashifi and it has nothing to do with versions of this Pahlavi text called the Testament of Hushang. Here, in Kashifi's version, this testament is simply a list of the 14 labels given to the 14 chapters of frame stories of the collection of fables. The king is understandably puzzled by this testament and he is told that he must go to Serendip to find the sage Bidpay, who will be able to illustrate the 14 points with illuminating stories. So what is Kashifi doing here? He is grounding the fables into the ancient Iranian world with its own theory on monarchy based essentially on justice, rather than continuing the all-Islamic view found in his predecessor's version. He is also relegating the Indian import to an illustration of these 14 precepts with the invention of the frame story and the embedded fables. He is stressing beyond any doubts the understanding and explanation and interpretation of the fables as addressed to kings, as concerning matters of state, as independent of morality. Kashifi's work, the Anvar-e Sohayli, was considered for many centuries as the best prose work ever composed in Persian. It is the influence behind a Mughal Persian version, behind an Ottoman Turkish version, and this Ottoman Turkish version itself is the origin for parts of the famous French collection of fables by Jean de La Fontaine. Tragically, Cambridge University, in the person of the great Persianist E.G. Browne, killed all interest and regard for Kashifi's Anvar-e Sohayli text. Browne had to use the Anvar-e Sohayli in order himself to learn Persian as a younger student, and he kept a very bad memory of it, a vivid hatred actually for it. He branded it with all the force of his disgust as a florid and verbose rendering of Kalila and Dimna. And since then, the text languishes in the dustbin of Persian studies. Scholars should never condemn a work on a matter of taste. And on this note I end. In my forthcoming monograph on the Anvar-e Sohayli text, I hope to set this right and to show the tremendous interest there is in studying the insights that the rewriter Kashifi had in the potential of the collection of fables and the significance of this fascinating, multifaceted collection of stories. Thank you very much.